Study Unit 1.3 Dynamics of Pulmonary Ventilation. At the end of this study unit, you should be able to explain the relationship between pulmonary ventilation and anaerobic threshold, as well as describe different terms regarding gas exchange, discuss the pulmonary system, and explain the changes due to exercising and conditioning. During part 1, we are going to discuss the regulation of pulmonary ventilation. What control are there in ventilation? What determines how I breathe? What determines the depth and what determines the rate? There are really complex mechanisms that change breathing rate and depth to meet the metabolic demands of the body. Sensors in the body receive information from various parts of the body and relates this information to higher brain centers, where ventrally control is applied, and then eventually sends it to the lungs. One immediately thinks of homeostasis. Receptors detect the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood and change alveolar ventilation accordingly to keep these variables constant. Even though we exercise at various exercise intensities, the homeostatic control systems will maintain alveolar and arterial concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide. This schematic shows us how different receptors perceive information and relays it to the respiratory center of the brain, the medulla oblongata. The medulla integrate this information and send an appropriate response to the ventilatory muscles. Also note that the motor cortex could have an effect on the respiratory center. Temperature, receptors in lung tissues, proprioceptors in joints and muscles, the chemical state of the blood in the medulla, peripheral chemoreceptors, the motor cortex, and subcortical areas of the brain send information to the respiratory center in the medulla oblongata. Let us first discuss the neural control of ventilation. The medulla oblongata controls the normal respiratory cycle of inspiration and expiration. Higher brain centers produces a smooth pattern of ventilation. These areas also react to the metabolic demands of the body and adjust ventilation accordingly. Active muscles send information to the cerebellum that further changes ventilation to meet the metabolic demands of the body during exercise. We just talked about neural control of ventilation. Now we begin to talk about humoral factors. Humoral factors are factors associated with blood. At rest, the chemical condition of the blood, oxygen levels, pH, carbon dioxide levels, exert the greatest control of pulmonary ventilation. Carbon dioxide concentration, pH, and temperature are variables that are maintained within thin limits by means of ventilation. What influence do oxygen levels exert on ventilation? Hypoxia or low oxygen are observed by peripheral chemoreceptors that initiate a ventilatory response. Of all the chemoreceptors, the carotid chemoreceptors are very strategically positioned as it monitors the blood that perfuses the brain. This protects you against a reduced oxygen pressure. What causes hypoxia? Pulmonary disease like COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. High altitudes. Exercise causes an increased ventilation due to increases in temperature, acidity, carbon dioxide, and potassium concentration that are observed by the carotid chemoreceptor. Let's talk about carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentration. Carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentration provides very important respiratory stimuli. Small increases in carbon dioxide and acidity causes large increases in minute ventilation. Without the stimulus provided by carbon dioxide, there will not arise a desire for oxygen, and therefore no oxygen will be inhaled. Certain sports have tried to reduce the urge for oxygen by the following technique: hyperventilation and breath holding. How long can a person hold his or her breath? About 40 seconds before the urge arises to breathe. This is a vital urge. On that moment, nothing else matters. The stimulus to breathe primarily comes from increased carbon dioxide levels and reduced oxygen levels. Hyperventilation causes carbon dioxide levels to decrease dramatically. Due to the low carbon dioxide levels, there will no longer be an urge to breathe, and thus one will be able to hold one's breath for longer. Swimmers make use of this. They hyperventilate on the blocks before their 50-meter freestyle. Then they do not need to break their speed by breathing. Divers also use this. Here, of course, I'm talking about free diving. They hyperventilate because they want to hold their breath as long as possible. It is obviously very dangerous as the diver can lose consciousness. How is ventilation regulated during exercise? Firstly, we'll look at chemical control. There is no single mechanism that determines why people's ventilation increases during exercise. There are multiple. Oxygen and carbon dioxide levels are well maintained during exercise, although we expect that carbon dioxide will increase and oxygen will decrease. Pulmonary ventilation is directly proportional to the metabolic demands of the body. One does not expect anaerobic exercises to cause an increase in ventilation, but it does. Why? Anaerobic exercises increase carbon dioxide and hydrogen accumulation, and this provides a ventilatory stimulus. That was chemical control, but what about non-chemical control? Ventilation increases too quickly that we can contribute this primarily to chemical control. Something causes it to increase faster with the onset of exercise. Examples of this is firstly cortical influence, that is part of the cortex. Peripheral influence, joints, tendons, muscles. An increase in temperature will also cause a small increase in ventilatory rate. Ventilation is regulated in an integrated way. How is ventilation regulated during exercise? Various chemical and neural stimuli initiate and change ventilation during exercise. This sketch you will remember from MBWK 219, where we talked about oxygen deficiency and EPOC. This whole process proceeds in 3 phases. When you're resting after exercise, one immediately thinks of EPOC, where the body recovers its metabolic, thermal, and chemical environment. Part 2 deals with pulmonary ventilation during exercise. In this section, we will refer back to 219 a lot of times. This figure you will remember from 219, where we've talked about oxygen and excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. You will remember this is steady state exercise. Again, this is repetition from 219. It illustrates how blood lactate increases with an increase in intensity. It also shows the difference between blood lactate levels of trained and untrained individuals. This figure illustrates blood lactate and ventilation on the same figure and how they are related. You will see here with blood lactate 2 points of interest, the point of lactate threshold and the point of obla, as you've already learned in 219. Let's relate this to ventilation. Here we've got minute ventilation and there's 2 points of interest. Point of ventilatory threshold and respiratory compensation. We are going to discuss all these terms in due time. Ventilation increases as oxygen consumption increases. Initially, there will be an increase in ventilation due to an increase in tidal volume. As exercise intensity increases, breathing frequency will increase as well. Ventilatory equivalent explain the relationship between minute ventilation against oxygen consumption. In adults, it is about 25 liters of air breathed per liter of oxygen consumption. Children have a ventilatory equivalent of about 32 liters of air breathed per 1 liter oxygen consumption. This is all good and well, but what happens during non-steady state exercise? Remember here, there is a massive oxygen consumption and a large EPOC. When exercise intensity increases sharply, minute ventilation will increase disproportionately to oxygen consumption. This is called ventilatory threshold. Ventilatory threshold describes the point where pulmonary ventilation increases disproportionately with an increased exercise intensity. Ventilatory threshold corresponds to lactate threshold. Why? This high ventilation is due to an increase in carbon dioxide concentration and lactate which must be buffered. Here we talk about obla, onset of blood lactate accumulation. Remember, lactate threshold is the highest oxygen consumption or exercise intensity that is achieved with less than a 1.0 millimole in blood lactate above pre-exercise concentration level. In contrast, obla is when blood lactate concentration increases higher than 4.0 millimole. How does lactate threshold and obla differ from each other? This is a possible exam question. Obla is caused by the following: imbalance between the rate of glycolysis and mitochondrial respiration, reduced redox potential, increased NADH relative to NAD, decreased blood oxygen content, and decreased blood flow to skeletal muscles. All of these factors favor anaerobic metabolism and causes a decrease in aerobic metabolism.
Think back to the principle of specificity. We will apply it to OBLA. The point of OBLA is specific for different activities. Variations in muscle mass activated explain the difference in various activities. What is the difference between OBLA or lactate and VO2 max ventilation? OBLA is determined by muscle fiber type, capillary density, mitochondrial size and quantity, enzyme concentration. These factors are all related to the specific muscles that are activated by the specific type of exercise you do. In contrast to this, VO2 max is determined by the functional capacity of the cardiovascular system for oxygen transport and total muscle mass activated. This is more centrally regulated, meaning the heart and the lungs. Performance in long distance running is thus dependent on running economy that is influenced by training, biomechanics, and anthropometrics. Percentage VO2 max at lactate threshold that is related to capillary density and oxidative enzymes. This is very specific to the type of muscles activated in the specific type of exercise you do. VO2 max is related to cardiac output and maximal arteriovenous oxygen difference. Cardiac output is the product of heart rate times stroke volume, while max AV oxygen difference is determined by hemoglobin and percentage saturation of oxygen. Endurance exercise depends on, firstly, your maximal capacity to consume oxygen, or VO2 max. Also, OBLA, your maximum level of stable rate exercise. The point is, not only VO2 max, but also exercise intensity at the point of OBLA predicts endurance performance. Which one of these two do you think is the most important? Improved endurance exercise performance with conditioning is more related to exercise-induced improvements in OBLA when compared to VO2 max changes. This states that specific muscles and local changes that happens in the muscles are more important than changes that happens in the heart and the lungs. Africa and South Africa endurance runners show a bigger resistance to fatigue when compared to their white counterparts, even though they have similar VO2 max and peak treadmill speeds. But why? They have a higher oxidative enzyme profile and a lower plasma lactate concentration during continuous submaximal exercise. The energy cost of breathing. This figure illustrates the oxygen cost of breathing when exercise intensity increases. A significant proportion of total blood flow maintains the metabolic demands of respiratory muscles during maximal exercise. A very important question is, do ventilation limit aerobic strength and endurance? Aerobic exercises causes small changes in pulmonary structure and function when compared to the adaptations in the cardiovascular and neuromuscular systems. This means exercise don't improve the respiratory system significantly. Can you remember this from study unit 1.1? When asked if you between specific breathing exercises or endurance training to improve breathlessness, what should you answer? Endurance exercise will always be better when compared to breathing exercise, as endurance exercise improves multiple physiological systems and not only the respiratory system. However, there is an exception to this. For top elite endurance athletes, their pulmonary system lagged behind their excellent cardiovascular and aerobic muscle adaptations to exercise. We call this exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia. The potential for an imbalance in alveolar ventilation relative to pulmonary capillary blood flow develops. The imbalance can put arterial saturation and oxygen transport capacity in jeopardy. This figure illustrates how arterial oxygen levels decrease with increased exercise intensity. Remember, this is in endurance athletes, where their respiratory system lag behind their excellent cardiovascular and neuromuscular adaptations. The causes of exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia are imbalances in ventilation-perfusion ratio in the lungs. Remember study unit 1.1 for this. Shunting of blood between venous and arterial circulation. Thus, it redirects an area of diffusion. Failure to reach end capillary equilibrium between alveolar oxygen pressure and oxygen pressure in the blood that supplies the pulmonary capillaries. This is a possible exam question. Explain why pulmonary ventilation for most healthy people don't limit their aerobic exercise performance. Part 3 is regarding acid-base regulation. Before we can discuss this, you need to understand what is a buffer. An acid is something that releases hydrogen ions. A base is something that releases OH negative. The OH negative neutralizes the hydrogen ions. This is a buffer. Buffer means something that minimizes the change in hydrogen ion concentration. pH is a quantitative measure of acidity or alkalinity of a liquid solution. The pH of the body liquids vary. For example, the pH in the stomach is very acidic due to hydrochloric acid. Arterial and venous blood is more alkaline because it's a value of 7.35 to 7.45. There's three mechanisms that regulates pH of the internal environment: chemical buffers, pulmonary ventilation, and renal buffers. In the textbook, there's a very broad explanation of each of them, but for this subject, you will only have to name these three mechanisms. What is the effect of intense exercise on acid-base regulation? Vigorous exercise causes an increase in hydrogen ion concentration due to carbon dioxide production and lactate formation. This makes pH regulation rather difficult. As blood pH decreases, blood lactate will increase. Homeostasis is usually very accurate, but not so much in acid-base regulation during maximal exercise. The symptoms of a disturbed acid-base regulation is nausea, headache, dizziness, and pain in active muscles. You might have experienced this when exercising maximally. If you've got any questions or queries regarding this study unit, you are welcome to contact me and email me for an appointment. The end.